One of the most horrifying fates imaginable involves people whom are hopelessly trapped. Be it in a mine shaft, a sunken ship, under a collapsed building, a damaged spacecraft, or in a submarine. For the submariner, the danger of being trapped is ever present, and there are numerous examples of submarine crews becoming stuck and perishing at the bottom of the ocean. Upon hearing about such cases, it is common to think of how we might react in such a scenario. Would it be better to just end it right away, or to try and survive as long as possible, and should a record be left to explain what went wrong? These were the decisions faced by Lieutenant Sakuma and the crew of Submarine No. 6. Japan's first submarines were built by John Holland's Electric Boat Company in the United States and were purchased during the Russo-Japanese War. Holland exported his submarines to a number of countries around the world. When war broke out between Japan and Russia in 1904, the Russians purchased 7 of these submarines. The 7 boats were designated as the Somme class, so named after the first one put into service. Meanwhile, to counter this new threat, the Japanese ordered 5 of Holland's submarines for their own navy. The boats were given the class designation of Type 1 and individually numbered 1 through 5. They were built at Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, then disassembled and shipped to the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in Japan. The submarines were then reassembled and made ready for combat by August of 1905. However, by this time the war with Russia was drawing to a close. These boats would remain in service until 1921, providing the Japanese Navy valuable experience in the design, construction, and operating of submarines. In parallel with the reassembly of the 5 Holland boats, Japan also began the construction of 2 additional submarines from scratch. The Japanese government assigned Kawasaki Dockyards in Kobe to construct a pair of submarines based on Holland's blueprints. These 2 submarines, designated Type 6, would enter service in March of 1906 and were individually numbered Submarines 6 and 7. The Type 6 class was a little lighter and longer than the American-built Type 1 class, but otherwise quite similar. In 1908, command of Submarine No. 6 was given to 30-year-old Lieutenant Tsutomu Sakuma. Sakuma had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1901. He was serving on the cruiser Azuma at the start of the Russo-Japanese War. He then transferred to the 15th Torpedo Boat Flotilla and eventually served on board the cruiser Kasagi during the Battle of Tsushima, which was an historic victory for the Japanese. Following the war with Russia, Lieutenant Sakuma became involved with the submarine service and was given command of Submarine No. 4, one of the 5 Holland-type submarines purchased from the United States, before assuming command of the Japanese-built Submarine No. 6. On the 15th of April 1910, Lieutenant Sakuma and his crew were carrying out routine exercises in Hiroshima Bay. The submarine was running under gasoline power on the surface with the hatches closed. Air for the engine was drawn into the submarine from a pipe that stood about 6 feet above the submarine's hull. At 10 a.m., disaster struck. For some unknown reason, most likely an error in the operation of the diving planes, the submarine dove deep enough to submerge the air intake. This caused a torrent of water to pour down the air intake and into the submarine. The crew immediately attempted to seal off the flow of water by shutting a sluice gate in the air intake pipe. The sluice gate was designed to be quickly shut by pulling on a chain, however at this critical moment the chain broke. The crew managed to close the sluice gate by hand, but this cost valuable time. The Type 6 submarine had little positive buoyancy, meaning it would take only seconds, not minutes, of water pouring through the unsealed air intake to sink the boat. The seawater inside the submarine ran to the stern, causing the boat to take a sharp up angle as it sank uncontrollably to the bottom 65 feet below. The water reached the electrical switchboard, shorting out the boat's electrical systems and plunging the men into near-complete darkness. The only source of light was a faint glow from the tiny viewports in the conning tower. The submarine was not far from port, so Lieutenant Sakuma knew that salvage vessels would likely be sent to raise the stricken boat. However, a salvage operation required time, and the small submarine contained only enough air to keep the crew alive for a few hours. If the crew was going to survive, they needed to save themselves. The men immediately began working to pump out the excess water holding the submarine to the bottom. After an hour and 45 minutes, a large volume of water still needed to be pumped out in order to make the submarine buoyant again. However, the air was rapidly becoming unbreathable. Even if a salvage team arrived now, there was not enough time left to raise the boat and save the crew. It became apparent to Lieutenant Sakuma that he and his crew were likely doomed. Instead of panicking or sinking into despair, the lieutenant remained calm. He knew it was highly important that the fate of Submarine No. 6 be thoroughly understood in order to avoid a similar accident in the future. Knowing that the submarine would almost certainly be salvaged, Lieutenant Sakuma decided to leave a written record describing exactly what had happened. Using the faint light provided by the conning tower viewports, he began to write down the preceding events in a logbook. Lieutenant Sakuma described the accident as follows, quote, "While going through gasoline submarine exercises, we submerged too far, and when we attempted to shut the sluice valve, the chain in the meantime gave way. Then we tried to close the sluice valve by hand, but it was then too late, the rear part being full of water, and the boat sank at an angle of about 25 degrees. The boat rested at an incline of above 13 degrees, pointing towards the stern. The switchboard being underwater, the electric lights gave out. Offensive gas developed, and respiration became difficult. At about 10 a.m. on the 15th, the boat sank, and under this offensive gas we endeavored to expel the water with a hand pump. At the same time as the vessel was being submerged, we expelled the water from the main tank. The light having gone out, the gauge cannot be seen, but we know that the water has been expelled from the main tank. We cannot use the electric current entirely. The electric liquid is overflowing, but no salt water has entered, and chlorine gas has not developed. We only rely upon the hand pump now. The above has been written under the light of the conning tower, when it was 11:45 o'clock. We are now soaked by the water that has made its way in. Our clothes are pretty wet and we feel cold. I had always warned my shipmates that their behavior, in an emergency, should be calm and delicate while brave. Otherwise we could not hope for progress, and that, at the same time, one should not cultivate excessive delicacy lest work should be slowed. People may be tempted to ridicule this after this failure, but I am perfectly confident that my previous words have not been mistaken. The depth gauge of the conning tower indicates 52, and despite the endeavor to expel the water, the pump stopped, and did not work after 12 o'clock. The depth in this neighborhood being 10 fathoms, the reading may be correct. The failure of the hand pump left the men with virtually no chance of saving themselves since there was no other way to lighten the submarine. Despite facing an imminent death, Lieutenant Sakuma recorded his belief that the crew had performed very well under the circumstances. He mentioned where to find his will and also expressed great concern for the family members of the crew and asked the Emperor to take care of them. Quote, "The officers and men of submarines must be appointed from the most distinguished among the distinguished, or there will be annoyance in cases like this. Happily, all the members of this crew have discharged their duties well, and I feel satisfied. I have always expected death whenever I left my home, and therefore my will is already in the drawer at Karasaki. I respectfully beg to say to His Majesty, I respectfully request that none of the families left by my subordinates shall suffer. The only thing I am anxious about now is this." The second to last entry describes difficulty breathing and the effects of vapors from the leaking fuel. Quote, 12:30 o'clock, respiration is extraordinarily difficult. I mean I am breathing gasoline. I am intoxicated with gasoline. Lieutenant Sakuma's final entry simply gives the time. Quote, it is 12:40 o'clock. Submarine No. 6 was raised the next day. The crewmen were found dead at their respective duty stations, having stayed at their posts until the end. Lieutenant Sakuma's logbook was recovered and the actions of the lieutenant and his crew became famous throughout Japan. The crew's dedication to carrying out their assigned duties and remaining calm under what must have been the worst circumstances imaginable were seen by many as inspirational. A gold standard for bravery and commitment to performing one's duty no matter how horrifying the circumstances were. Lieutenant Sakuma and his crew did everything they could to save themselves and had maintained their composure despite the great tragedy of the situation. Submarine No. 6 was repaired and put back into service. It would remain in service until being decommissioned in 1920. Instead of being scrapped, the submarine was moved to the Korea Naval Arsenal where it was converted into a memorial. Unfortunately, this memorial was destroyed soon after the Second World War on the orders of Douglas MacArthur. It is hard to understand how such a submarine could possibly represent a threat since by this time Submarine No. 6 was completely obsolete and hadn't even been in the water for 25 years. Surely, this monument would be greatly appreciated if it were still around today. During World War II, many Japanese submarine crews would follow the fearless example set by the men of Submarine No. 6. Beginning with the midget submarine raid on Pearl Harbor, where every crewman fully expected it to be a suicide mission. Japan also deployed a number of innovative submarine designs, including the I-400, which was the largest submarine in the world at the time and capable of carrying 3 full-sized aircraft. Lieutenant Sakuma would probably be happy to know that Japan's development of advanced submarine technology remains ongoing. Today, the memories of Lieutenant Sakuma and his crew are still honored in Japan. In the city of Korea stands the No. 6 Submarine Martyr Memorial, which includes a shrine, tower, and engraved stonework. There is also a memorial hall dedicated to Lieutenant Sakuma in his hometown of Wakasa. The story of Submarine No. 6 still resonates in the present day. It is hard not to empathize with fellow humans trapped at the bottom of the sea and to feel admiration for those who selflessly carried out their duties to the very end. The actions and sacrifice of Lieutenant Sakuma and his crew will no doubt continue to be remembered and admired for centuries to come.